So, folks, we finally figured out Kamala's policy agenda. Donald Trump's in a more annoying voice.
This is the first time I've said this. When I get to office, we are going to not charge taxes on tips,
including to raise the minimum wage and eliminate taxes on tips for service and hospitality workers.
That's right. Kamala, the copycat fraud, lifted Donald Trump's popular no tax on tips policy idea and passed it off as her own. And she announced it in the same city that he did just 2 months later. And now KJP is getting in on the gaslight naturally.
Trump was the first to endorse eliminating taxes on tips. He's accusing Vice President Harris of stealing his idea. So did she get this idea from Trump?
Look, I'm not going to respond to a presidential candidate.
If similar bill made its way to the President of the United States, President Biden, would he sign that?
Absolutely. Look, this is something that the president supports. He supports eliminating taxes on tips for service and hospitality workers while also raising minimum wage and preventing the wealthy from gaining the system.
I'm a little confused for a few reasons. First of all, I thought everything Donald Trump did or proposed was racist and bad. Why then is Kamala copying him literally word for word? And secondly, how can Kamala be for no tax on tips when the Biden-Harris administration released a plan just last year to do exactly the opposite of that and crack down on waiters' tips? But guess what else is changing? The way the media feels about the plan now that Kamala stole it from Trump. Just look at the side-by-side. Oh, let me guess. Under a President Coconut, the policy will cost nothing but a side of smiles and some rainbows. Unbelievable, truly. Next, Kamala is going to promise to make America great again. Here to dive into the brass tacks of it all is New York Post financial correspondent Lydia Moynihan. Lydia, it's great to have you. A big economic day. So I want to start off right there with the no tax on tips thing. Now they both want no tax on tips. Is that a good policy, objectively speaking, now that I guess they share a brain on it?
Evidently. I mean, it is interesting because this is a overwhelmingly popular policy. More than 2/3 of voters like it. So as soon as Trump was gaining ground with that, Kamala thought, okay, I don't want to give him any advantage, particularly in Nevada, as you mentioned, where both of these candidates endorsed the policy. Now, when you look back historically at what Republicans and conservatives like when it comes to tax policy, it's pro-growth, simple, easy tax policies. And part of the reason that the economy was so great in the 80s under Reagan and then pre-pandemic under Trump after he enacted those tax cuts is because they were pro-growth policies. So we lowered the income tax on individuals, on businesses, and we lowered the capital gains tax, which meant you paid less when you invested in the stock market and made money that way. And those policies basically encouraged people to get back to work. Now, some Republican strategists have basically pointed out with the tax on tips that you might basically just be giving a carve out to a certain group of people and making the tax code more complicated. And I know a lot of people are anecdotally quite annoyed when they go not just to a coffee shop or a nail salon, but now an online kiosk and they're asked to tip. So imagine how much more that's going to be happening in the coming years if this policy was enacted. So again, the Trump tax cut was so effective because it was pro-growth and it just simplified everything. It got rid of any carve-outs for special groups and it encouraged growth. So I don't know that this policy really aligns with what Trump has previously done.
This is why all of this is so confusing, because the economy and inflation are so important to the American people, Democrat, Republican, Independent, somewhere in the middle. But it's so hard to figure out what is actually going to be economically advantageous for especially the middle class, because there's so much politics involved and we really don't know what we should believe or what we should advocate for. No tax on tips sounds great. I mean, it's obviously going to be advantageous for those who exist and work off tips. And I think that consumers feel better when we do have to tip people or we do have to add that, even sometimes how we feel unnecessarily. But if we feel like 100% of that is actually going to go to the person, it makes us feel better. The last thing I want to do is feel like I'm tipping and then tipping the government. I don't want to tip the government. They do a horrible job. I'd rather tip the person that's doing the service, even if sometimes the tip fatigue does set in. So it's a little confusing for people to know what it's going to add to the debt.
And Tommy, too, just to note, I mean, the challenge is that a lot of people aren't paying on tips. That's why when you go, the hair salon, the nail salon I go to, they only accept tips in cash, no credit cards. So I think there are a lot of people skirting this. So you can make the argument that it basically levels the playing field because a lot of people aren't actually paying tax on the tips that they're getting.
Yeah, it's also another aspect of this, which Trump has brought up recently, is no tax on Social Security. Again, it sounds good. I'm obviously a Trump supporter, but I really want to get the insight on this, not from a political perspective, not from what's going to sound better for the candidate that you advocate or support for, but just really economically what's actually viable. Because I don't like any of the BS when you're talking about people's money. I don't care who it benefits. I want to know a no tax on Social Security. Is that actually viable for our economy as we stand today?
When it comes to tax, it is a zero-sum game. So if you have one group that's paying less, that means that somebody else is going to have to pay more to make the budget get balanced. And the issue with Social Security, and I would note both Social Security and these tip things are very popular with demographics that Trump and Kamala need to win. But the concern with not putting any tax on Social Security is basically it's a sort of further transference of wealth from younger people to the older generation. And a lot of these people who are collecting Social Security, they actually are getting more than what they paid into the system. And so taxing it is a way to sort of even that out. Again, I am in favor of lower taxes. Most economists who historically have been pro-growth, sort of conservative economists, are also in favor, generally speaking, of lower taxes. But this tax specifically doesn't necessarily even the playing field. The other thing is when you think about taxes, it's really about what incentivizes people to do. And so that's why economists like taxes that give people more of their own income, that incentivize them to invest in the stock market. This doesn't really incentivize the kinds of things that you want to incentivize. Basically, if anything, it just gives people more money to not work. And so again, no tax on anything sounds great, but we do have to have taxes on some things. And it's better to incentivize, people getting back into work, investing, rather than just not paying on tips or Social Security.
Yeah, I understand why these proposals are popular. They sound good and they sound actually pretty simple. It's a good policy for a lot of people that don't understand the ins and outs of the tax code and the Social Security and all the complex things that go along with actually introducing a plan. We really haven't got one from Kamala, to my knowledge. But, I worry about what all this is going to cost. And I also, in going along with that, I fear sometimes that in an effort to be politically popular, both sides promise things that they can't deliver. But then I also worry about, on the conservative Republican side, I worry about promises that are going to turn us into more of a welfare state. And that's why when J.D. Vance has been talking about expanding the child tax credit, the childcare tax credit increase, that worries me a little bit. He wants to take it from $2,000 to $5,000 to incentivize people having kids. And I understand that sounds good, but for me, as somebody who's a real limited government person, I'm like, okay, well, you're just incentivizing people to essentially be married to the government, have more kids, get more from the government. That to me sounds like an expansion of the welfare state, not a reduction of the welfare state. Is that something that you think, because I don't know, is that something that you think that would help middle-class families and also help our economic growth, or are you a little concerned about something like that being implemented?
Again, it sounds great. We do want to encourage people to have kids. Ideally, they're married first. And so the incentive piece makes sense. This is actually a bigger tax credit than what Democrats have proposed. They proposed $3,600. And the concern when they unveil that is it's going to be really expensive. And what's interesting, Tommy, is, we have declining fertility rates. People are having less kids. But what we've seen in other countries is even when they spend a staggering amount of money to encourage people to have more kids, it doesn't actually really increase the fertility rate. It's crazy. In Austria, they give people 2.5 years government paid maternity leave. In Hungary, they give you a $30,000 loan when you get married. And if you have 3 kids, it gets forgiven. Hungary spends almost 6% of their GDP on encouraging increased fertility. We spend 3% on defense, which is a lot. And what we've seen is it still hasn't really moved the needle for them in encouraging people to have kids. So what this seems like is something that's really expensive, I don't know that it's going to move the needle. And again, I mean, all of these things sound great. They really do. But you have to think about what actually makes sense and what's fair. And the other concern, and this is why people loved the Trump tax cuts, is because they simplified things. The idea was that maybe eventually you can actually just do your taxes on your own, which feels sort of impossible right now. But those were all about simplifying the tax cuts. And as soon as you start adding in these loopholes, basically appealing to special interest groups, that makes it more complicated. That means you need more accountants and lawyers, and that's not the kind of incentive that we want. And what's crazy, I was doing some research for this segment, H&R Block, TurboTax, some of these tax company or accounting companies that help you with your taxes, they've spent billions lobbying Congress and politicians over the years to make filing and taxes complicated because it actually makes them money and keeps their business possible. So the more that you can simplify, the fewer loopholes, the better it is for everyone, and the fewer IRS agents you need. Because right now we have, 80+ thousand that have been hired in the last year or so. That's a lot of people to add to the government payroll who are now trying to figure out how to enforce what is becoming an increasingly complicated tax code.
No, absolutely. I think you're 100% spot on with that. I think everybody wants things to be more simplified because it helps people budget better when you don't know where you stand.
At the end of the year.
It's too much for people, and people are busy and they don't have the time to look into what this is going to do to our national debt and all that, and they just go off of a tagline, and I don't like that for either side. I especially, going back to the childcare stuff, I don't like incentivizing people with money to have kids. Not that we shouldn't be helping people make childcare more affordable and having a family more affordable. I believe in that. But dangling money to have kids, to me, I think you should be a parent if you're ready to be a parent and if you can take on the responsibility. It's not just economic. It also has a lot to do with just being, a mature adult. So to me, those things, they bother me a little bit. I have a lot of issues with J.D. Vance, that being one of them. New reports coming out. And again, another thing that the American people are having a hard time deciphering. We're getting reports from pretty much every outlet that these new inflation numbers or consumer price index numbers are great, 2.9%, that we're supposed to be celebrating that. It's supposed to mean that inflation is cooling, or the CPI, consumer price index, is cooling. Things are becoming less expensive. I don't think Americans are feeling it, but are you, I guess, do you feel better about these numbers coming out? Do you feel like it's something that we should rah-rah for, or should we not get too excited?
Well, I mean, when you consider that last year we were close to 10%
Wow.
for inflation, it's a lot. In comparison, 2.9%, which was the number today, is better. But when you consider the fact that still means things are still getting more expensive, almost at 3%, and you look at specifically where, because the consumer price index breaks out where are things getting more expensive, 5% for shelter. So people are still really feeling the pinch on their wallets. Again, it is coming down clearly, but it's still not the number that we want to have. And so the Federal Reserve typically targets a 2% inflation rate. And the difficulty, Tomi, is even if we got inflation somehow to 0%, which is not a goal, but let's say we did, it would still mean that we're paying higher prices than we were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because inflation has been so high. So prices have spiked. They're staying at those levels. And so even though they're not increasing as quickly as they were, we're still paying the high prices that we've been paying all along, and they're still increasing a little bit. So it kind of sucks. And I think you hear these talking heads who are like, oh, inflation is cool. Everything's great. People should be thrilled. The economy is wonderful. And that doesn't really reflect the reality that people are feeling, that I'm spending more on groceries than I ever have before. I'm spending more to fill up my car with gasoline than I ever have before. And that's real. And even though inflation, based on what you're seeing, if you're in ivory tower, is better, it still is pretty bad. And we're still experiencing all of the pain of prices surging over the last couple of years.
Yeah, for me, in just layman's terms, somebody who's not an economist like yourself, I look at it and it just feels like they want us to accept that things are more expensive. It's like, well, they're not getting more expensive, but eggs are still $8 a dozen. But that's at least they're not $12, but $8 was still unaffordable. So now we're just supposed to celebrate that they're still $8 and not 12, but we can't afford 8. So that's the part where a lot of Americans are still feeling the pinch. All Americans.
It is interesting too, because this is one really difficult area to actually like pull the wool over people's eyes. I feel like there's certain things with that employment rate, you can hear these numbers and you're like, oh, that sounds good. But this is one thing where people go to the grocery store, they see like, okay, I remember how much I was paying for DoorDash or to go to the grocery store a couple years ago. You can't gaslight people when they know how much money they have in their wallet at the end of the month. They know that they're not saving as much. They know that they don't have the pocketbook, to go out and do as many fun things as they were. So you're absolutely right. I feel like the messaging is very much like, it's great, it's sunshine, it's rainbows, everyone's doing fabulous, don't worry about it. But the reality we know is that it's really a difficult time, like it has been the last couple of years.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because there is a voter on NBC, not a conservative network, that was talking about inflation and talking about the economic pressures that she and a lot of Americans are facing. And it was really heartbreaking to hear. But this sentiment is shared by millions of Americans. Let's take a listen to the plight that she's under.
How hard has inflation hit you?
It hit me hard. It's hitting me hard.
Who do you blame for it?
I blame the federal government at this point. If a working class mom who works as a paralegal cannot buy a $2 bell pepper because it's now $5, imagine a mother living on food stamps. Imagine a mother who's making minimum wage trying to feed children. They're killing us without killing us. If you understand that. They're killing us without telling us they're killing us. They're hurting people in ways that they can't help themselves. It's either feed my child or how about feed my children and I don't, but I have to go work.
We should never be experiencing that in the United States of America, that somebody that works hard, that has a job, 1 or 2 jobs, can't afford to feed themselves and their family. But that is the reality for so many Americans. And I don't know if there's a magic solution that any candidate can offer us, but shoot, it's got to get better than what it is now. Are you optimistic that anybody's going to be able to fix this?
I mean, to your point, Tommy, I think we don't want a government like communist state that's basically saying you have to make prices this and that. So it is a painful time. And I don't think there is one single solution. But what we know is that Biden and the Biden-Harris administration has done things that have made it more difficult for businesses. And I think that in turn makes things more expensive. Another reason gas is surging. We're not drilling on our own land. We're not allowing pro-energy policy. So there are things you can do with regulation that I think will encourage prices to come down, but it doesn't happen overnight. But I think it is interesting because Kamala obviously is surging. She's having this moment where people are into her vibes and her joy and everything that she's offering. But I think people are going to remember that under Trump, bell peppers were $2 and they were able to afford more groceries. They were maybe able to go, not to Disneyland, but at least take a vacation. And Harris, even though she's doing this pivot where now she's saying, actually, I don't want any tax on tips. I think people will remember that she's in office right now. Things aren't great. And the policies that they have enacted have made things more expensive. So the Inflation Reduction Act, right, that put more money into the economy. And inflation happens because you have way too much money chasing too few goods. And so prices go up. And so they've just injected more and more money into the economy. That's creating this. So we know that they want more policies like that, and that's going to make things worse. So I think you can incentivize and encourage things to either become cheaper or more expensive. It does take time. And I think voters will remember that these are the policies that they have moved forward, and this is the direct result of that.
I hope so, because I think a lot of people, though they can kind of remember what life was like in 2018 and 2019, because of the COVID years, a lot of people kind of conveniently forgot that time, and for good reason. But it feels like the COVID years lasted for a long time, and then everybody was just put on pause almost, and we just lived in this hellhole of BS. And then I remember at the start of COVID, when people weren't allowed to go to work, which is insane, people were really antsy, like they wanted to go to work. work so badly. And then after it dragged into like 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, they didn't want to go to work anymore. And then they wanted the mailbox check. They wanted their stimulus. They wanted to get these programs, and they felt like that was, a better gig for them than actually going out and working. And I think that changed the whole mindset. And then you had people that didn't want to go to work. So you had a hard time getting people to come back to work, and you had to offer them these insane wages to get them to show up on time. Yep. People just wanted to get their unemployment. They wanted to get their mailbox checked. They would go and, not even show up for their interviews just so that they could say that they got one, so they could get more money from the government. And it warped people's minds in such a way that I don't know if we can ever go back to the time when people just wanted to work hard, but also were able to afford life if they just did work hard and didn't game the system. And I'm wondering if we get either candidate in, it's still going to be an uphill battle for anybody. I think anybody that thinks that either candidate's going to be able to just go in and wave a wand and things are going to magically get better, I don't see that happening. And I don't see how we get from point A to point B. And I'm wondering what your advice is to people out there who are living on a budget day to day, working hard. They want to maybe afford a house. They don't want to rent anymore. They don't want to pay someone else's mortgage. What are some common sense things that people can do, regardless of politics, that put themselves in a better spot?
Yeah, and Tomi, you touched on this. I think there is this sort of malaise that people are feeling. And especially in our generation, people are like, okay, I'm going to work super hard and I still won't be able to afford a home. And especially our generation, so many people are facing these horrible student loans that are just a millstone around their neck. And so I do think there's a lot of depression and sadness among this generation. They don't feel like they're going to be able to get the American dream, which I think is one reason why we don't want to transfer more money to Social Security recipients, because I think this generation is having a tough time with that Social Security tax that we spoke about. Look, I think, again, unfortunately, there's no magic bullet, but I think the more that you can get access to the stock market, the more that you basically can put your money in a place where it works for you and creates passive income, the better. So even if you have, $10, whatever it is a month, if you can start putting that in the stock market, definitely contributing to your 401k. There are some sort of technicalities that if you put money in your 401k, you can sometimes get access to that to make a down payment on a home or some other emergency spending that you may need. So the more that you can be saving, really the better off you are. And especially if you have a 401k where your employer matches, it's tax-free, that's really the best thing that you can be doing. And again, it's not just for retirement. Sometimes you can access it for emergencies as well in the meantime.
I'm gonna tell you something that's frustrating for me as a millennial who is, recently 32 years old. I have a lot of friends. I have a lot of friends who are renting, and they have been renting, and they're in their mid 30s or early 40s, and they cannot buy a house because they cannot afford the interest rates. But I also see, kind of a trend, and I think social media has contributed to it because I have friends that are in this position, and I personally don't understand it, but I see a lot of people, because of what they see on social media, they want to be like these influencer type people, and they want to carry designer things. They want to go on fancy vacations. They want to live up to this lifestyle that they see on social media. But then they also say that they can't afford to buy a home, they can only rent. And that's a real thing. People are having a hard time. But I think that there's also needs to be like a come to Jesus moment for millennials and even elder Gen Z, that they need to understand that like these lifestyles that they see on social media, people making millions of dollars on OnlyFans and things like that, that's not reality. And I worry that we're not teaching people what actually matters in school and how to save and how to invest and how to have a retirement. Like that to me seems so far gone for even my generation. And I don't know how we snap people back to reality when you've got social media convincing people that they need to have a luxury appearance of a lifestyle, but then they can't afford a damn home.
You're right. Well, and I think that's why saving is so huge, because it's so easy in this moment to just like spend all your money based on what you see your friends doing and what you think they're doing, what you see all these influencers. I mean, it's really difficult. And I feel like you're totally right. As a culture, we used to really value being thrifty and saving money and being smart. And I don't think that's a value anymore. Now it's all about whatever's flashy and conspicuous consumption. And it is interesting because I've been thinking about this a lot recently too. We talk about economic conditions are really tough for this generation. But I also think we are looking at the past with rose-colored glasses. Like I remember my mom always talking about, her parents couldn't afford a house until they were actually in their 50s, and they really had to save and work towards that. So I think it's this combination of like difficult economic times with people who have way overinflated expectations. And there was this popular article that went viral, like, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, but it was talking about how happiness is the difference between expectations and reality. And unfortunately, we're kind of in the worst situation where expectations have never been higher. And this is a generation, of course, it was, told growing up, you're going to have a perfect life. You're so special. You're going to be a star.
Mm-hmm.
And that generation is facing challenging economic conditions of super high interest rates, super high inflation. And I think that's created just a recipe for a lot of sadness and people who aren't happy and aren't really thinking about the future.
Well, and maybe if we taught people the basics of economics in high school, I would say middle school, high school, certainly college. A lot of people don't really get a crash course on any of this until they have to do it. I mean, myself included, I didn't learn about tax policy in high school. I didn't learn about tax policy in college. And I think there's a lot of people that would benefit from that, maybe less on like the history of women's studies and DEI and like change your gender, and maybe more on how to save for retirement.
Yeah.
Useful skills.
No one teaches you how to budget. And
No.
I think that's what's crazy is even among, people in their 20s and early 30s, like there's still all of these very basic questions that people aren't sure how to answer. They're like, wow, I'm spending all this money on rent. Is that normal? I'm spending this much eating out. Is that normal? Like people just don't know. There's no guidelines out there for how people should live.
Yeah.
And I know, it's interesting because millennials get such a bad rap that they're spending on avocado toast and this and that. And obviously there's huge macroeconomic factors at play with interest rates and student loans. And I think that is such a huge part of this too. I mean, people were told to go to college, told to get a liberal arts degree, whatever it is. And now they're facing this horrible reality where they have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And I think that everyone has to take responsibility for their finances, but that was something we encouraged and put on kids as young as 18.
Yeah.
I digress. Anyway, but I think millennials are criticized for avocado toast and this and that. But I do think I look at the way my parents lived, how thrifty, how good they were about when we went out to eat. We didn't get drinks. We didn't get appetizers.
Yep.
Now, whenever I go out to eat, I go crazy and getting cocktails and all of that. So I think everyone wants to have a nicer lifestyle than their parents, and it might not be the case. And I think that's a hard reality to come to terms with.
But if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. Like if you can't afford $18 avocado toast, I'm sorry, like life's not fair. And I think more people need to hear that, and they need to get a real grasp on it. And the economy is crap right now, but I think that a lot of people are hurting themselves by living outside of their means because they want to feel rich, and that's a real problem. But I appreciate you giving us, the solid answers on all of this, because we can't just look at the politics, no matter if we are solidly Republican or Democrat. It's about what is actually going to help the economy. So I appreciate you for giving it to me straight. And thanks for taking the time. I hope to have you back soon.
Thanks so much, Tomi. It was great to be here.
Great to talk to you. All right, folks, from one dismal report to the next. A migrant rapes a 15-year-old girl allegedly and gets released for a few $100. And many Americans, well, they just don't bat an eyelash anymore. It's time for Final Thoughts. All right, so it's a headline that's become far too common. A migrant allegedly rapes a teen girl, gets out of jail on $500 bond. Local law enforcement ignores ICE detainer request, and then ICE has to spend time, money, and use resources to track him down on their own. Just another day in Kamala Harris's America, my friends. Thank goodness ICE was able to capture and arrest this gentleman, Corey Alvarez. But why the hell was he out of jail in the first place? Massachusetts, run by compassionate Democrats. That's why. Alvarez is a Haitian migrant that, get this, was flown in under that Biden-Harris travel agency glorified parole program. And he's accused of raping a 15-year-old girl at a migrant hotel that he lived at. Glad to know our tax dollars are funding safe spaces for rape, right? That's just lovely. Well, his lawyer, which I assume we're also paying for, says he's innocent of the charges. His lawyer says the 15-year-old didn't have injuries and came out of the hotel room looking A-OK. I'm sorry, why was a 15-year-old girl in a hotel room with a 26-year-old Haitian migrant? Are we supposed to find that appropriate? Well, either way, he was released on a $500 bond with an agreement he'd stay in home confinement and surrender his passport, which he apparently did. But it still begs the question, though, why is a non-citizen charged with aggravated rape of a child allowed out with a few $100 of bail in the first place? Why are we giving migrants accused of child rape the benefit of the doubt? This is the most unnecessary game of Russian roulette, and the Biden-Harris administration expects you to accept it as if it's normal. It's not. But I'll tell you what's become far too normalized: migrant crime. Americans from both parties should be outraged when something like this happens, or something like this, or this. But no. We're expected to shrug our shoulders and say, bummer, and move on to the next headline. We don't have to live like this, you know. Our parks and hotels and communities don't have to be dumping grounds for the rest of the world. We don't owe the world that, not at all, but we're expected to tolerate it. Well, under Kamala Harris anyway. I'll tell you what, this is going to get worse because winter is right around the corner. We've got millions of illegals in this country who are going to need somewhere to go. And if they don't have somewhere to go, or if it's not up to their standards, they're going to get desperate. And this self-induced chaos is going to get way worse. But Democrats want you to take it on the chin and get over it because closing the border and mass deportation is mean. Right. Okay. Well, those are just my final thoughts. Please be sure to tune in tomorrow again live at 1 p.m. Eastern. Also, catch full episodes of this show on Fox Nation at your leisure. Also, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Tomi Lahren is Fearless. From Nashville, God bless and take care. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want more of my hottest takes, must-see conversations, and of course, my final thoughts, click here and make sure you subscribe here so you never miss a beat. I will be here every weekday, and I hope you'll join me.